Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again today from Houston in Texas. We're going to start off today's show by discussing U.S. politics, and we're going to continue to discuss what happened in Capitol Hill with the riot there by pro-Trump supporters. Now, the U.S. police have also now come under criticism over what's being seen as double standards, right, in the way that they dealt with Black Lives Matter protests throughout 2020, for example, and how they dealt with these protesters slash rioters, however you want to term them, at Capitol Hill. Why were they not as aggressive with these protesters as they were with the BLM protesters? We've seen those images, of course, of earlier BLM protests around Capitol Hill, in fact, where there was huge police presence. Why wasn't that the same case with this Capitol Hill protest as well? Is that a clear sign of racism and or just double standards in how police deal with these various forms of protests? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Darrin Porcher, who is a criminal justice professor and expert. He's a former NYPD lieutenant as well. He's joining us this morning from New York, New York. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Joseph Williams, who is the senior news editor of the U.S. News and World Report. Joseph and Darrin, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Darrin, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this accusation of double standards?
I think it's difficult to support that conclusion so early on. It was clear that the Capitol Police didn't put forth the necessary provisions to protect the Capitol and the elected officials in the hall of Congress. And as a result of the inability to put forth that security agenda that was necessary, the Capitol was subsequently fractured. Police officers shot an individual, and we had a police officer that was killed. There was mass pandemonium as a result. There's been several people that have been removed from their positions, coupled with us looking at the after-action report and making the assessment that it wasn't handled properly. It begs the question of why wasn't the necessary security schematic introduced to prevent this violence? That being said, when we look to a contrast and comparison to what happened in the death of George Floyd in the wake of several riots and demonstrations that have occurred throughout the United States, it does appear as if there's been a disproportionate difference from a security perspective. But I come from the place of, look, let's focus on what's happening now and let's ensure that this doesn't happen again.
And Joseph, what are your thoughts on that? Because, as I said in my introduction as well, as Darrin there pointed out, certainly, yes, Capitol Hill police did not live up to their obligations. That's, I would imagine, across the board, everyone would agree with that. But beyond that, what of the double standards accusation?
Well, I think it's kind of clear, at least from the surface. Yeah, we are going to have an investigation and figure out exactly what went wrong. But I mean, from my perspective and from looking at the riots up close in D.C. as well as the Black Lives Matter protest, the problem here was the battle was lost not yesterday or Wednesday, rather, when the mob stormed the Capitol. That battle was lost weeks ago when you had mobs that were online. The president himself was promoting this rally. You had people online discussing openly bringing weapons. You had people online talking about how they wanted to storm the Capitol and take people hostage. I mean, the difference and the double standard to me is quite clear, because when you have Black Lives Matter protesters, even much smaller groups than this, automatically police tend to come with a heavy hand. They tend to have a higher profile. Here, because the groups were white, it was automatically assumed, or at least from what we understand, it was assumed that they were not a threat. The Capitol Police, in fact, said that they didn't think that they were a threat. They decided not to have a high profile because they didn't think this was going to happen. Now, clearly, one group of protesters, the Black Lives Matter protesters, tend to be peaceful. Yes, there have been some skirmishes, but those skirmishes largely were on the fringes and very small in number, compared to what you had yesterday, where people were openly talking about violence for weeks on end. The president himself was talking about how he wanted people to come back and get tough and storm the streets and take action to get the government back. Those words are words you should not take lightly, no matter who the protesters are. There were hearings on Capitol Hill asking if the Capitol Police were prepared. They said they were. Clearly, they weren't. And you have to ask yourself, what is the difference between the two groups? And from what I can tell, Derek is absolutely right. There has to be an after-action report. There has to be an analysis to figure it out. But some answers seem pretty obvious to me.
Darrin, if I may ask a very blunt question, then, do you think it is, as Joseph has said, and as many experts have said, and I'm sure you're well aware of that, because BLM protesters, not all of them, of course, there were many others who took part also, but were African American or people of color, that they were treated differently because the narrative about them is more negative, is filled with more negative connotations than the narrative about white protesters. Is that just reality, do you think?
In my professional experience, I feel it is very difficult to make the assessment based on the color. I think that we need to focus more so on the groups and the ideology of the groups. And I'm just speaking as my background as a former police practitioner. Normally, whenever you assemble a public safety provision in the wake of a demonstration, you generally look to the number of people, the ideology, and who's actually showing up. And when you triangulate those three components, that's when you'll apprise what your security mechanism would be. Now, what's happened in, let's say, be it an Antifa rally, a Black Lives Matter rally, one may argue that there's been a more robust fortification of personnel in comparison to what we saw on Wednesday, which occurred at the Capitol. That being said, I don't know what the assessment that was conducted on the side of the Capitol Police was. You clearly had different factions that you can utilize if you didn't have the appropriate number of personnel at the Capitol, be it the National Guard or the Washington, D.C. Metro Police. Now, I believe that the mayor of Washington, D.C. discouraged the deployment of the National Guard troops to in the area of the Capitol and wanted the National Guard not to be in uniform and not to be armed. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is an African American, so this was their call. So once again, we can't really go specific to what the race of the individuals are, and we need to refer back to the ideology of the groups, the number of people that were responding, and who was actually showing up. And this is merely my professional opinion on this situation.
Joseph, do you get the feeling that even though Donald Trump, according to many, and I know you alluded to this as well, may have very well encouraged this sort of quote-unquote protest / riot, that he was sort of caught off guard that it went to this extent? Because, he seemed to fairly quickly, in Trump terms, back down in the sense that, he did then say that there would be a smooth transition of power, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed more reconciliatory than normal Donald Trump, at least in these days since the election took place. Do you think there was some surprise there? He was sort of caught off guard.
I think that there are images that came out in the news the day of the riots that had Donald Trump sitting in his office watching gleefully and his family looking at what was going down at the Capitol and cheering it on and say, yes, this is our power. This is us taking things back. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to suggest that Mayor Bowser, if she did say that, that it's malpractice on her part and it's malpractice on the police part, because we have seen the situation over and over again. Charlottesville, there was a light police presence, one person dead, 3 state police troopers died in a helicopter crash. Michigan, the state legislature, they stormed the Capitol building and they threatened to take the governor hostage. There was an active plot. We saw nowhere near the level of resistance that we saw with Black Lives Matter protests, even much smaller ones. Yes, we have to understand who's showing up, but these people told us who they were again and again and again. And for them to, even let's assume that Mayor Bowser suggested that the National Guard keep a low profile, overrule her. You are police. You are head of security, and there was testimony in the House of Representatives where the head of the Capitol Police said, "Yes, we've got this under control." Clearly, they did not. And I think one of the reasons why they did not is because typically there tends to be assumptions around black protests and white protests. And there's been a lot of intelligence saying that white nationalism is a very serious threat to the United States of America. It has not been taken seriously until now. Perhaps it will be after things were destroyed, after the national capital was breached and after 5 people have lost their lives, including 1 law enforcement officer. So I believe that, yes, I understand you do not always go on what you see, but to me, it seems fairly obvious, and the track record is there, that white nationalist violence is taken far less seriously than peaceful protests by African Americans.
All right, so Darrin, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On that very last point that Joseph there made about white nationalist violence, right? However we want to term it, and I know that we can probably term it in other ways as well, but just that ideology overall. Do you think that it is a fair accusation, that it is taken lightly? Because the evidence seems fairly clear.
Well, I'm a firm proponent, and we need to address, and I refer to this as domestic terrorism accordingly. This is something that's been specified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they've identified that a lot of these far right groups have presented somewhat a challenge to law enforcement, and they haven't been taken as serious as they should be. I'm in wholehearted agreement for that. I think that it's necessary that we do what's in accordance with a security provision to ensure that our society is being maintained in a safe and peaceful manner. If we need to provide a more robust security matrix, I'm all for it. But I think that we need to look through the lens of what works. And what works is you need to have the necessary security provisions in play, whether it's a Black Lives Matter protest, whether it's a white nationalist protest, whether it's an Antifa protest, or it's any group. You need to have the necessary boots on the ground. And it's clear that that didn't happen as a result of the incident that occurred on the Capitol on Wednesday.
Very well, Darrin and Joseph, we appreciate both of your times today on early Saturday morning to share your thoughts with us about what happened at the U.S. Capitol Hill building. Of course, the ramifications of that still very much being understood. As Darrin there correctly said, yes, there has been swift accountability in some regards, where certain people have been fired. Many people have resigned as well, as you will note. But then the double standards just overall in the way police dealt with this protest versus how they dealt with BLM protests, Black Lives Matter protests, right at the same venue, really. It is astounding. What went wrong? Why did they assess that this would not happen? As Darrin there said, clearly something went wrong with the assessment. But as then Joseph there said, I mean, it seems fairly clear cut. I mean, those were Black Lives Matter protesters. These were white nationalist protesters. They were dealt with in very, very different ways. What does that say about the story of the United States in the year 2020/2021? Not much. And I would imagine that shows very much the racial divides, according to many experts. Not just my words, of course. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, coming to you, as I said, from Houston, Texas. In this extended segment, in fact, we're going to discuss issues related to Palestine. We're going to start off with discussing the issue of Issa Amro, who is a non-violent Palestinian protest leader. He's being convicted by an Israeli military court for essentially daring really to protest, if we're completely honest. Of course, the charges against him are a lot more specific than what I'm saying right now. But nevertheless, Amnesty International, as well as other human rights groups, have said that the case against him is politically motivated and sets, of course, precedents, right, for other such protest leaders as well, non-violent ones, is an important point to also mention. And then secondly, we have then the issue of peace talks, which have been stalled, especially since Israel has refused to stop settlement expansions. The Egyptians are now trying to convince both the Israelis and the Palestinians to restart those talks at this time. Will that bear fruit? Is either side really in a good place to be able to begin those talks at this time? Let's discuss both of those issues a bit further. We're joined now by Jeff Halper, who's director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's joining us today from Jerusalem. And joining us today from Tel Aviv is Gideon Levy, who is a journalist. Jeff and Gideon, thank you very much for your time today. Gideon, let me start with you. Let's start with the case of Issa Amro. What do you make of it? Why go after somebody who is nonviolent?
Why go after thousands and thousands of Palestinians who try to resist an illegal occupation? if anyone needed still a proof that in Israel, in this so-called only democracy in the Middle East, there are hundreds of political detainees, political prisoners, here comes the story of Issa, who has nothing to do with violation of any kind of law, who is using only legitimate, minimal legitimate means to fight an unlegitimate occupation, and here he goes being charged, being brought to justice and being sent to jail. He's not the first one, he's not the last one. An occupation cannot last for so many years without those phenomena.
Jeff, what's about this? Because, we are talking as Israel would and propagates itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, etc. It's not setting a very good example, is it?
There's different levels to this struggle. On the most basic level that Gideon is related to, we have to be in solidarity with the Palestinians who are suffering every single day. I've known Issa for years. He's a very brave person. I mean, he's in probably one of the worst places, if you even rank worst places under a violent military occupation. Hebron is absolutely hell. And the fact that he's managed to stay out of jail for so long is a testament, I think, to his ability to find ways to manage and negotiate, navigate the occupation. But in the end, it can never succeed. Israel's control is absolute, and in particular, people say, well, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Here's the Palestinian Gandhi. The Palestinian Gandhis are either in prison or they're dead. In other words, they are the ones that are the most dangerous for Israel, because their resistance, which is a nonviolent resistance, which is political, but really, in the belly of the beast. I mean, dealing with, as you can see in these pictures, dealing with the very fiber and meaning of occupation as it affects people is something that Israel can't tolerate. And so the first thing, before we get into the politics of it, although that's crucial, is we have to really have a solidarity with people like Issa.
All right, so Gideon, what then are the ramifications of these sorts of moves, right? And as you said, of course, it's not like Issa is the first, and it's not like he'll unfortunately be the last. Because I would think that the ramification is that the Palestinians continue to be pushed into a corner, don't they? And then that's probably not a good thing either, right?
Palestinians are being pushed to the corner for so many years, decades. And one should be honest and realize that they tried everything. They tried violence, they tried diplomacy, they tried boycott, they tried resistance, they tried demonstrations, non-violent demonstration. Everything failed. As my friend Jeff just said, the Palestinian Gandhi is in jail. The Palestinian Gandhi has no chance because Israel is by far too strong and violent, and the Palestinians are by far too bleeding and lonely. Don't forget that the world had forgotten the Palestinians in recent years, and they are really left on the side of the road bleeding with almost no partners, no supporters except of civil movements and societies, but not governments. They are all left alone, and those Issas are trying with their naked hands to fight against an impossible enemy, namely the occupation.
So then, Jeff, in this sort of situation then, let's talk about peace talks, because Palestinians are in a corner, have been in a corner for a very long time, as Gideon there said. The Gandhis, as both of you have mentioned, on the Palestinian side, that is, are in jail or in some sort of detention of sorts. Is this a good time for the Palestinians to even enter negotiations? What would the Israeli point of view be on that, do you think, as well?
Understand that there are no There is no basis for negotiations. I have a new book coming out in the next week that's called Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, in which I show, like many, many others before me, that Zionism was basically a settler colonial movement. It had no intention of dealing with the Palestinians, recognizing their national existence, recognizing their rights, allowing a Palestinian state to be constructed in the center of our country, the land of Israel. It's unilateral. Settler colonialism is unilateral, and its job is to take over the country. We use the term to Judaize the country, and to displace and confine and get rid of the indigenous Palestinian population. That's the reality. And there's no negotiations. Israel's not going to ask the Palestinians if we can take over their country. Israel's not going to compromise and give 22% of our country to Arabs that have no right to it, according to Zionism and Israel. The two-state solution has never, ever, ever been a viable option. And in fact, I think what's really important is that the PLO was right at the very beginning when they said this is an anti-colonial struggle for liberation. Then in the 70s and 80s, they backtracked and tried to play this diplomatic game of two states and negotiations, in which Israel wins. And so now I think we're at a process. I'm part of a group called the One Democratic State Movement that's trying to go back to the idea that this is a settler colonial movement, and the only way out is through decolonizing the entire country and creating one single democratic state here, not negotiating over some fake two-state solution that Israel will never agree to.
I wonder what your thoughts are on that, Gideon, because I would think that the Egyptian foreign minister who put this sort of request forth, the negotiations beginning, he's not the first, certainly, would argue that, listen, at least talking is better than not talking, right?
By all means, I can't agree to this, and I couldn't agree more with Jeff. Listen, it was an ongoing masquerade which enabled Israel to continue the occupation while showing its nice face to the world as if it's just waiting for a Palestinian partner, for a Palestinian Messiah, in which Israel sent intentions of peace, only let's find the partner. This was maybe one of the biggest lies of the Israeli occupation. Namely, as Jeff just said, Israel never had the slightest intention to put an end to the occupation, to enable a Palestinian state. Not a single Israeli prime minister had it in his mind, including those who gained the Peace Nobel Prize. And in the same time, the Palestinians got weaker and weaker, and the occupation got stronger and stronger. This masquerade is over and shouldn't be renewed, because if we renew this masquerade, it means that the world will get back to this illusion that Israel has the slightest intention of putting an end to the occupation. It was never a peace process. It never got to any achievements for the Palestinians, only for the occupation, and it should not be renewed, not with the current actors.
Jeff, we are in a different world now, right? Where we have a lot more Arab countries that have normalized ties with Israel now, and it can be argued that all of the above had relations with Israel probably behind the scenes for many, many more years than what we've been made to believe. But publicly, at least now, it's all come out. What does that change for the Palestinians then, do you think, when it comes to the issue of negotiations, if anything?
Well, I think my view is, and I think the group that I'm working with, the One Democratic State campaign, which is Palestinian-led, we're beginning to formulate this strategy, is that the only ally of the Palestinians is what Gideon had mentioned, the international civil society. Church groups, religious groups, human rights groups, political organizations, intellectuals. We have to replicate, in a way, what the ANC did in South Africa. On the one hand, the ANC knew that the whites in South Africa were not going to be partners in dismantling apartheid. And on the other hand, they knew the international community, the governments of the world, weren't on their side either. They called Mandela and the ANC terrorists as well. So their strategy was to bypass both the dominant populations and the governments and to go directly to the people of the world. And we had the anti-apartheid struggle. I think the Palestinians have that basis. You know, with BDS and campaigning, there's a worldwide movement for Palestinian rights. What's missing is a political program. What do we want? What's our end game? And that's why we're trying to fill it. We have a 10-point political plan, and we're trying to insert that into the, and if we can succeed in doing that and mobilize civil society around a clear plan of a single democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens and the return of the refugees, then I think we can win. We can beat the governments, and we can force the Israeli public to basically to integrate. In other words, there already is one state. Now our job is simple. Yeah. It's to transform the single apartheid state that Israel has already created between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens.
Gideon, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On that point of the Israeli public, how does one convince the public, which I would think probably perceives that it has the upper hand, right, at this point in time in this situation, to even, live in one democratic state, as Jeff there mentioned, as it, by default, we sort of are already living in one state, not democratic necessarily, arguably. But how does one convince the public that that's in that sort of situation?
It's a very long way to go, because the one-state solution means, by definition, the end of Zionism, which is the informal religion of Israel, and declaring yourself as an anti-Zionist or even a non-Zionist in Israel is like declaring yourself as a traitor. And therefore, to go to this way, to this path, which is the only open path, but for the very long run, the way I know what will not work. It will not work with niceties. It will not work with trying to convince the Israelis that the occupation is immoral. For 53 years, it didn't happen. It will not happen. Israelis will not wake up one shining morning and say, oh, the occupation is not so nice as we thought or as we were told. Let's put an end to it. No, it will not happen like this. It will happen only if the Israelis will be found accountable, will be punished, and will pay for the crimes of the occupation. And then when this moment will come, they will ask themselves, maybe the first time in their lives, is it worth it? Does it worth it? Are we ready to pay the price for the occupation? Because until now Israel didn't pay any price for the occupation. And then there will be the question of what do you prefer? A Jewish state or a democratic state? You can't have it both. If you want a Jewish state, you have to obviously pull out from all the territories. It will be too late. And then the question is only, are you ready to live in an apartheid state, or do you really wish to live in democracy? This question will be also aimed at the international community.
Very well. Gideon and Jeff, we sincerely appreciate you both taking your time out of your schedules to share your thoughts with us. Viewers, stay with us. We'll be back after this break, continuing the discussion on this topic. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to continue to discuss the case, as I said, and the conviction of Issa Amro, who's a non-violent Palestinian protest leader, as well as the Egyptian foreign minister's push for peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Is this even the right time to have such talks altogether? We're going to continue that discussion through two new guests. We're now joined by Laith Marouf, who's an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. He's joining us today from Beirut. Joining us today from Birmingham is Hawwash, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Kammel and Laith, thank you both for your time today. Kammel, let me start with you. Let's obviously start with the Issa Amro case. What do you make of it? He's not the first, or unfortunately probably will not be the last such Palestinian activist to be convicted. But it's just interesting that he is nonviolent, right? So on the surface of it all, this really doesn't make sense, right? Why go after him?
I think one of the most significant quotes I heard over the last week in connection with this case was from Issa himself, when he said, basically, the occupier wants the occupied to seek a permit to resist the occupation. As you say, he's a non-violent person. He's very well known around the world. He advocates peacefully. In fact, just living in Al-Khalil, Hebron, seeing these illegal settlers, these people who've come and stolen that land, they have no right to be in Hebron because, in fact, even under international law, it's illegally occupied. And a few hundred of them are protected by by a couple of thousand soldiers just to keep them in that place. They make the lives of Palestinians miserable. And in fact, they do their best to try and push them out of their homes. So here we have somebody who says the way to resist this is to do it peacefully, to go on demonstrations and so on. And Israel says, in an illegally occupied city, you have no right to protest unless we give you permission to do so. It is absolutely absurd, and the allegations that he's been convicted of go back over many years. And if you only looked at what happened in Washington a few days ago, many Americans would be in prison for long sentences if they sort of faced the same court, at the military court that Isa faced. And as you say, he's not the only one. And we also think in these terms of the children who are hauled up in front of these military courts, where there's a 99% conviction rate, shackled, handcuffed, left in vans for hours. So yeah, I mean, even peaceful resistance is not allowed. And the point is, the more that Israel closes the path for peaceful resistance, the more chance that people will resort to violence.
And that's a very good point. In fact, Laith, I wanted to bring that point up with you because they are being pushed into a corner, right? The Palestinians have always been ready. But do you think in some ways the goal might be to actually push them into a corner to such an extent that they have no choice but to violently react?
The main reason for convicting nonviolent resistance to apartheid Israel is to criminalize any objection to the violence that this entity vets on the indigenous population. So we know that not only nonviolent resistance in terms of demonstrating is criminalized for the Palestinians, but even speaking about it, tweeting about it, Facebooking about it, writing poetry about it, acting about it, performing art about it is criminalized. And we've seen, these poets that are citizens of the apartheid state, Palestinians that are from 1948 territories, that were put in jail for years for writing a poem on Facebook. So this is actually an example of the fragility of the apartheid state. It has reached a point that it cannot even tolerate speech against it. And the scary part, if we want to connect it to an international situation globally, is that we see Twitter and Facebook actually becoming arbitrators of speech. They've been banning tens of and hundreds and thousands of Palestinian accounts or accounts that are supportive of Palestinian human rights and liberation. And now we are at the point where these social media outlets have had uber arbitration rights where they're banning President of the United States or deleting the tweets of the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran. So we're at a dangerous situation globally, and this is all because apartheid Israel and the empire that rules it from DC are in a very fragile moment of their existence.
Kammel, it would be argued, I would think, of course, from the Israeli side, as you said, the argument is that, Isa needed to have certain permits to be able to even protest peacefully, right? If I was just to play devil's advocate, it's possible that is the case in other democratic countries as well, where it can't just be a free-for-all, right, when you come out to protest, that there are certain limitations even on those rights. What are your thoughts and how would you respond to that?
There's no comparison. If you're in Britain and you're a British citizen with full rights, and you, as a group or through an organization, want to protest, yes, the law says in certain circumstances you must have a permit. So you go and discuss it with the police, and you ask to have a demonstration. Say when we here in Britain are able to meet in person to have a demonstration to commemorate the Nakba, that's what we do. We discuss it with the police. We have stewards, etc. This is completely different. These are an occupied people. They are not Israeli citizens who come under civil Israeli law. The Palestinians come under military Israeli law. When, as I say, in courts, under the military courts, there's a 99% conviction rate. But when a settler, so an Israeli citizen, so that's the comparison really. If a settler wants to has committed any offense, they are seen in the civil courts. So, Israel can't have it both ways. It can't claim to be a democratic country, but at the same time practice apartheid policies against a people it occupies, to whom it should be delivering what it has to under international humanitarian law. But it doesn't do that. And the controversy over the last few days about the fact that Israeli settlers who live illegally on Palestinian land are provided with COVID vaccines, but so far the Palestinian people who are occupied in Israel have not had any vaccinations. So it shows you the divide. It is an apartheid system that exists, and particularly in Al-Khalil Hebron, if people go and see it for themselves, and people thankfully do, and come back absolutely shocked that in the 21st century you have, one side of the road for Palestinians, one side for the settlers, but we also have this additional problem that the Israeli Defense Force, supposedly called the Israeli Defense Force, which claims to be the most moral army in the world, protect the settlers while they carry out offenses against Palestinians, but the Palestinians have no right to resist or to go to court and stop them.
So then in such a situation, Laith, then we throw in the Egyptian foreign minister, right? Saying that the Palestinians and the Israelis should be talking, that there should be peace talks, and those should be resumed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's too little, too late, and it's also suspicious at this moment for the Egyptian foreign minister to make such a suggestion. We are seeing right now for the first time the Palestinian factions pledging to have an election from leadership of both Hamas and the PLO, Fatah. All of them agreed, and there will be an announcement of elections for the parliament and an election for the president that are going to coincide, hopefully. So this is why we see Egypt right now trying to play a client role to the United States and apartheid Israel. By opening such discussion, they want to create a schism again between the Palestinian factions that, most of them other than Fatah, and including Fatah, have now openly said there's no use of the Oslo agreement and as if it's null. So we're going in a different direction, and maybe this is only going to add to the decline of Egyptian influence on Palestinian issues.
But then, Kammel, the question always then remains, in the absence of talks, what is the alternative?
There haven't been any talks since 2014. If you remember, the talks then were led by John Kerry, who gave himself 9 months to try and resolve the situation. But the problem with all of these initiatives is that they are not based on international law. Whatever people's wishes, Hamas or Fatah or individual Palestinians, whether they want, a state across the whole of historic Palestine or not. The point is, in international law, it is clear Israel illegally occupies the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The Palestinian refugees have a right to return to their homes. If the negotiations are not based on achieving that, achieving it, not negotiating about bits, then you're not framing it in a way that will deliver the most basic justice for Palestinians, because we're still talking about 22% of historic Palestine. So the problem with this, and they're talking about, for example, bringing the quartet in. What the heck does the quartet exist for? What has it done since it was set up by Tony Blair? It's done very little. It was supposedly helping build the Palestinian institutions for statehood. They were ready many, many years ago, but the Palestinians have not had freedom delivered. So if any talks that happen are about the end of the occupation, the end of apartheid, that's a completely different thing to what the Egyptian foreign minister is talking about. It is about the resumption of the Obama era, where there are negotiations forever. Israel continues to build. People condemn it around the world, including in this country here in the UK, for building illegal settlements, but won't take any action to stop it doing so. So it's less space for the negotiations are international law, and there is a strict deadline by which Israel must withdraw from all these occupied territories, and a Palestinian state is created. And as I say, that is not something all Palestinians agree is enough, but that is what international law says. Then we'll just enter another phase where the Palestinian leadership are happy to be going to negotiations but achieving very little. At the same time, Israel just continues to sign more normalization agreements, or subservience agreements, as I call them, with Arab states, and everything seems healthy for the Israelis, while the Palestinians are in not a temporary occupation, but a perpetual occupation.
All right, we'll have to leave those a final word. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. But we thank both Kammel and Laith for their time today. And of course, we're contextualizing not just the case of Issa Amro, as we've discussed also with Gideon and Jeff in the first half of this discussion, but also, this Egyptian foreign minister's statement about his desire, or his country's desire, for talks between the Israelis and Palestinians to restart something that's been stalled since 2014, as Kammel there mentioned. And one of the important things, as even Gideon and Jeff had mentioned, was that the Gandhis of Palestine essentially are in jail. Their words, not mine. And then in such a situation, can you really then expect the Palestinians to want to go into talks, enthusiastically? What are they to gain from this, if anything at all? And then if it is, as Jeff had mentioned as well, a one democratic state, which is the only logical conclusion, how will we even get there? Because the Israeli public is so right-wing, seemingly at least, looking from the outside in. Can they even be convinced in such a position that is the best way forward also for them? I'll leave it for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.